Today's rec video will be a bit different from the usual format. I have, in one of the first videos, covered USS Lexington. CV2, that is, not the still afloat CV-16. One of the notable things about that wreck were the planes scattered around it. Planes that are in amazingly good condition. Damaged, of course, but several of them survived their fall in more or less one piece. And now, decades later and miles beneath the surface, they look like museum pieces. In the video on Lex, I touched on these planes, but they weren't the focus. In this video, the focus is on the aircraft. I suppose you could call it more of a plane wreck video than a shipwreck video. I would normally do a brief discussion of the sinking, but as this video is focused on the aircraft, I'll move straight to the wreck. For those interested, I have a much more detailed video on Lex's history that I'll link in the description. As for the wreck, that was discovered by RV Petrel, the usual suspect in one of these videos, as a team that found many shipwrecks in the 2010s. Lexington's wreck was located on March 4th, 2018, at a depth of around 3,000 meters, or 9,800 feet. As with Lex's history, I'll link the dedicated shipwreck video for those interested in more detail. For now, we can move to the aircraft. Several were located near the wreck, mostly TBD Devastators, with a couple SBD Dauntlesses, and a single F4F Wildcat. I will go in reverse order for this video, beginning with the fighter and ending on the torpedo bombers. Now, let's look at that Wildcat. This is one of the best preserved aircraft located by Petrel. There is visible damage, of course. The engine is a rusted mess. It fell away from the plane, taking the cowling with it. The wing is also damaged. The covers for the machine guns are gone here. And here, next to that, you can see some separation in the wing itself. Not to mention the fact it's detached from the plane, or partially detached towards the front. There isn't really a good view, here or otherwise, of the other wing. Even so, there are other things worth looking at. From this angle, you can see the canopy is still mostly intact. It's pulled back, with much of the glass still in place. That is yellowed with time, but it's still there. As is the paint. This will be a running theme on the aircraft, but it really is impressive how well that's lasted. On this specific angle, you can see the victory tally, as well as the squadron insignia. We'll come back to that later. First, and moving back, you have two things of note. The star looking like it was painted yesterday. There's absolutely no fading there whatsoever. And just ahead of that, you have the number, F5. Except, looking at the 5, it seems to be painted over an older number. You can see the fading pattern on the paint. I've seen reference to this plane originally being F13, which would match with the repainted number. Regardless, let's move on. Here, closer in, you can see the other markings better. There's some definite fading, but the 4 victories are still crisp, along with a bomb symbol here, and the Felix the Cat insignia here. That marks this aircraft as part of the Squadron VF3. Moving past that and to the cockpit, you can see a lot of sea life. It's clustered around the opening into the cockpit, along with the seat inside it. And yet, that seat is still recognizable, at least the metal backing. Up close like this, the yellowing on the glass is easier to see as well. I think the most interesting thing here, though, is right beneath the cockpit. Here you can barely make out some letters. On the next picture, that's easier to see. Although it's on the other side of the plane, it's the same writing. AYLE. That's part of the name of the pilot flying this plane at Coral Sea, Lieutenant Noel Gaylor, who was credited with 2 kills and a 3rd probable before he returned to Lexington. By that point, the ship was damaged, and he couldn't take off again, leaving his Wildcat behind. Gaylor is quite a character, and probably worth a video of his own at some point. He would end his career as an admiral in 1976, and only passed in 2011, at the ripe old age of 96. It's a shame he couldn't live long enough to see his old Wildcat again, but I don't think anyone can say 96 years old isn't a good, long life. But, well, Gaylor's career is for another video. That picture rounds off the Wildcat, so now let's look at the Dauntlesses. Here we go from one of the best of the planes to the worst of the lot. There's a lot of fire damage on these, which would make sense if these were placed further forward on the deck. They were subjected to more of the fires, and the result is apparent today. Take this one, which is the best of the lot. The entire center of the plane has burnt away, leaving a twisted mess on the bottom. The engine is gone, and the cockpit is completely destroyed. One of the wings is gone too, while the other is buckled and pointing up. In any case, there's not much else to make out here. The insignia on the intact wing is a bit more faded, but the damage makes that understandable. You can also see the dive brakes, both on the intact wing here, and in the debris next to the plane here, from the destroyed wing. The next picture, meanwhile, moves closer in. Here, the paint and fabric remain quite intact. There are parts missing here and here, but that's it. Interestingly, I think there's a tear in the fabric here. The fact you can make out things like that, after 80 years underwater, never ceases to amaze me. The same goes for the writing. For example, the bureau number 4531. And while it's hard to make out, you can see SBD 3 on the tail. There might also be an 11 at the top, which would match with comments on the Facebook post. This plane was identified there as S11, a plane of Squadron VS2, the scouting squadron. The next plane, in even worse shape, was also identified by the same commenters. This one is less a plane at this point, and more 1.5 wings. However, the more intact wing has some visible markings. A more faded star, and what is apparently a black 11 here. The combination of those factors marks this as an older SBD-2 compared to S11, which was an SBD-3. This particular bird was, apparently, B-11, from Squadron VB-2, the bombing squadron. There's not much else to say about this plane, however. As such, I'll briefly touch on what little remains of 2 other SBDs, or possibly one SBD in 2 pieces. Here we have the center section of one, missing its wings and tail. It's inverted on the bottom, and there's very little left of it. The engine is a pile of rust, and the rest isn't much better. There's also no identifying features. The other piece, for its part, is the detached tail of an SBD. Maybe the last one. The only identifying feature here is a black 8 towards the top. That, evidently, marks it as S8 from VS2. The rest of the plane is long gone. Now, with that done, it's time for the Devastators. These are interesting because no such planes survive in museums today. Well, no original Devastators survive. There is a replica made for the more recent Midway movie. That aside, the planes near Lex are in varying states of preservation. This one here is one of the worst. The plane is inverted on the bottom, with the tail broken from the main fuselage. There's a famous picture of Lexington sinking, showing a plane blown off the ship. This might be that aircraft, although it's impossible to know for sure. It wouldn't be a surprise, though, considering the level of damage. Petrel identified it as plane T3, but I'm not entirely sure what basis they used. I can't make out a 3 on any of the parts visible here. The next plane is a different story. This one does have a clearly visible T1 written at the top. Although that was lucky to survive, considering right beneath it, the plane broke. You can see some of the tail here, but the rest of it is out of frame. Otherwise, there's just a jagged tear where the aircraft broke in two. Nonetheless, this plane is still in good shape, outside the obvious damage. I think the most interesting thing here is that you can see the ribbed pattern on the wing. This is a very distinctive feature of TBD Devastators. That's not as visible on the next one, T5, but that's balanced by having more of the fuselage visible. This one also had the tail broken off, but it was further back. That allows for seeing the massive star with its early war red circle on the side. Just like on the Wildcat, this looks like it was freshly painted. Not like it spent the last 80 or so years a couple miles underwater. The other notable features on this plane are the 5 on the wing here, and the other wing still folded in storage position. I'm not sure if it was left that way when the plane was still on Lexington, or if it got folded up as the Devastator fell off. The next plane in line, T8, continues the theme. Another destroyed tail, another folded wing. The paint is a bit more faded here as well, while the plane rests on top of its broken tail section. That leaves it at something of an angle on the bottom. This one also has a better look inside the cockpit, or what's left of it. There's no sign of the defensive weaponry, and the cockpit is full of silt and marine life, with more of the growth on the side of the plane next to the star. And now, with that plane covered, we come to 2 more Devastators. These are laying together on the bottom, with one inverted on top of the other. T9 is the bottom one, while T4 is the inverted one. There's not much difference on these compared to the last ones, other than the fact their tails remain attached. You can also see here and here where the wings are folded up. That's a nice look at the folding mechanism that you'll never see anywhere else. The planes aren't quite as pretty from the front. As is common, the engines have rusted away and fallen off. And T9's wing is crumpled beneath T4, where it landed on top of the other plane. This second look at the front is a bit higher quality, and you can clearly see where the engines used to be, although on both planes, the propellers are still visible, along with their paint scheme. As for the last shot of these planes, T4's belly shows where the torpedo would have been carried. Not a bomb bay in the strictest sense, but it is where the torpedo was placed. As you can see here, it created an angled look to torpedoes on Devastators. Before we move on to the last 2 aircraft, a quick look at another TBD here. Mostly notable because of the clearly written Navy 0345 on its side. That aside, of the remaining 2 Devastators, T12 here is the less interesting, at least in regard to condition. It's pretty much in line with the others, with mostly intact paint and a missing tail. What makes this plane interesting is the crew claimed 2 hits, one on Shoho and the other on Shokaku. While Shokaku wasn't hit by any torpedoes, that still makes this an incredibly important plane, especially by the standards of Devastators. And now with that done, we come to the last aircraft. This is T11, which is probably in the best condition of any of them. The wings are both attached, the fuselage is intact, and the tail is in pristine shape. Comparatively speaking, at least. Naturally, the engine is gone, and the cockpit is in rough shape, but the plane is, for the most part, in one piece. If any of these planes should be raised, this is probably the best candidate. It's never flying again, but T11 would make an excellent museum piece. The only real exception, other than the engine, being the tail. It is intact, but it's also pretty badly beaten up. The frame is cracked and broken. Even so, this plane is incredibly well preserved, right down to evidence of being repainted by the star. I know there was a plan to raise some or all of these aircraft. It hasn't gone past the Navy yet, of course, but it is an interesting thing to think about. Just imagine these planes in a museum, especially Gaylor's F4F and the Devastators. There's a lot of history here, to say the least, especially if you're a fan of naval aviation. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.